Welcome, folks, to 52 Living Ideas. I'm delighted to have my friend Leon Tsao here. And he's going to be, he's a psychotherapist and an MBTI blogger. And he's been into, MBTI for a long time. He's had, amazing insights for that. And today he's going to be talking about a really interesting topic, and that is personality development using cutting edge psychotherapy tools. So it's kind of intersection of MBTI and psychotherapy. So not just kind of one kind of psychotherapy, but a whole range of psychotherapy tools on one side and MBTI on the other, an intersection of that. So that's what we're going to be talking about. So Leon, take it away.
Hey everybody, I'm very glad to be on this call and to have all of you here. I think that is amazing. I really appreciate this support I'm getting with this call, and to see this level of enthusiasm here, I'm absolutely thrilled about that. I'm taking these two loves that I have and I'm putting them together, the MBTI and psychotherapy. And, I spent basically years and years in each, years of studying psychology, of course, and being a psychotherapist for the last couple of years. And so you're gonna get some really good information here, things that come from all those years of looking into both of these areas. So I'm gonna get started. I'm gonna show you how I relate the two. And I'll be speaking from my own research and also my own clinical experience as well, working with clients, working with people who are different MBTI types, how that's like. Of course, very much respecting their confidentiality. So I'm speaking in very vague terms when I talk, and of course, not mentioning names. And also I'm going to be very general about it too. So I'm going to get started here. I'm going to put my slides up.
Okay, while Leon is doing that, I want to let people know. So the format today is that Leon is going to present. I will ask him a few questions along the way, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So if you have questions, keep them ready. And you can actually type the questions in. You just start the question with an exclamation mark, and then we will do Q&A. After Q&A, we are going to do breakout rooms. So we're going to be able to discuss all the ideas that Leon is presenting in small groups of about 6 to 8. Then we'll come back and talk about our takeaways. We will extract all the kind of common patterns from the takeaways and do kind of a final list of topics based on that. All right, so with that, back to you, Leon.
Okay, so let's start with the MBTI. And I'm going to immediately relate it to psychotherapy straight off the bat, and how these terms, feeling, thinking, sensing, intuition, how is this related to the field of psychotherapy? How do psychotherapists interact with these different aspects of people? So there are feeling types, thinking types, sensing types, intuiting types, and we're, of course, a mixture of these processes. We prioritize them in different kinds of orders, but I want to make sure that we come to a general agreement about what the terms are, because, for instance, like feeling, there's a difference between how we use it in our regular parlance and also how Jung used it, and also how it's treated in psychotherapy. So both feeling and thinking, these are decision-making kind of processes. So you have to look at feeling as more than emotion. It has something to do with emotion, but it's a decision-making process that takes emotion and is able to find out what your underlying need is, or what the underlying need of somebody else is through that emotion. And therefore, it's able to make a decision based on values, because your needs speak to what your own values are. It's very different from a decision-making process such as thinking. Thinking, it's much more linear, and it's very clear. It's very much based on semantics. So Carl Jung would talk about thinking and say that the benefit, the advantages advantage of thinking is with words, because you could very clearly delineate its process using language. So feeling is, it's a strange process, but of decision making, but just as valid and just as useful as thinking. Sensing is attunement to the bodily functions, attunement to bodily awareness, memory, and everything that has to do with actuality. So in terms of you want to actualize things, in terms of bring things into the reality of the world to make it manifest in a very physical and tangible way. And it's helped by intuition, because to do that, to bring things to actuality, it's very helpful to know what the possibilities are, the things that are unseen and are kind of invisible, the things that are behind the surface, what you can't just see with your own very eyes. This is where intuition comes in. So of course, everyone is a synthesis of these processes. So the key to psychotherapy is to draw the connection between feeling, thinking, sensing, intuition. And there is a very general order to doing this. So that's why you see the F that's represented in red, that's feeling, that starts first. And then you go over to sensing, and then to thinking, and then to intuition. And I'm going to explain why this is the case. So you'll see why this is important. So let's say, okay, I'm going to take you all to my psychotherapy office, right? Take you all to the office. Every one of you shows up, and I'm going to ask you these questions. I'm going to ask you, first of all, like, if you are struggling with something in your life and it's a really difficult thing that you are undergoing, I'm going to ask you, how do you feel? I'm going to ask you, how do you feel? Because that feeling is salient. Emotions are very salient. So thinking, it's very cognitive, it's very forebrain, but feeling kind of gets to the essence of things in a way that, and I think it's a very important marker for clients to be able to understand what their feeling is. So a lot of therapists, especially even in cognitive behavioral therapy, where they think that changing your rationale and your thinking is a very important aspect of that psychotherapy, they ask about feeling first. Then, not all psychotherapists, but some, including me, we would ask, well, after you're feeling this, where do you sense it in your body? Where is it? Like, so you have that emotion, and it could be experienced as this tenseness in your shoulders, right? And then someone who's very high on intuition, low on sensing, they kind of have like no awareness of it. So this is a very big aha moment for them. Where are they carrying it? And people could very much look down on sensing. They think, oh, that's, intuition is very noble because it's about insight. But sensing, I think you could read a lot about someone through how they carry their body. Because if they develop some sort of neurosis, they might tense up in a certain kind of way. They might start to walk a certain kind of way. They might have, like for me, like I grew up with social anxiety, a lot of tenseness around the jaw, a lot of pain around the jaw here, right? So asking where it is, where do you notice these things, helps you become in tune with your body. And let's go back to feeling here. There's feeling here, ask how you feel. And when you know how you feel, then you could ask, so what do you need when this emotion shows up for you? This emotion showing up for you, what do you need? And remember, feeling is not just emotion, it's encompassing your need, right? So what do you need at a fundamental level? And then afterwards, then I say, so now you feel this, and now you sense you're feeling sad or you're feeling anxious, and now you feel that anxiety in your shoulders right now. So when that's going on, what thoughts pop into your mind right now? So these are your thoughts. This is your kind of rationale, right? So people have a way of thinking. They draw some sort of conclusions, often these very if-then conclusions about things, and they're both either they're either rational or they're irrational. It doesn't matter if you're thinking type or feeling type. There's a lot of thought of thinking processes, and a lot of them can be very irrational, right? So it's important to ask, like, to kind of clarify. So you take all the client's thoughts and you kind of help them find clarity about where are they making these if-then statements, right? If I do not do well in my MBTI presentation, MBTI psychotherapy presentation, then I am a loser, right? So I have thousands and thousands of thoughts, but it could all basically come down to this basic premise, right? And then that causes me to freeze up, makes me think that if I don't perform well, then then that's terrible. And there's other things like thinking talks about the importance of semantics. So how are you using your words? How are you using your words, and how are those words dictating how you think about things, right? So a very important thing is that a lot of people have should statements in their mind. So I should be doing this, or I should be doing that. But where is it written that you should be doing this or that? Where is it written that I should give, if I should give this amazing presentation, right? For instance. So really you could change your shoulds to prefer. And often when you do that, you change that statement from should to prefer, then you start to soften up. And I could actually physically see my clients start to soften up, right? So that's interesting because this brings it back to sensing. So when it comes to psychotherapy, I'm always paying attention to feeling, sensing, thinking, intuition, and not just any one of them. So when you're thinking and you're changing those thoughts, I'm going to watch your body. I'm going to see if you're softening up because of what you're saying, or you're tensing up. You're using those should statements. Often I see the client just getting very stiff, right? And I also want to know how they feel. And the last part here is intuition, because, taking everything together, what kind of meaning do you draw from your experience? So always asking, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by a loser, for instance? So you're calling yourself a loser. What do you mean by that? And they have some sort of idea, a conceptualization, right, of what a loser is. That's not something that's seen. That's not something that's concrete. That's something that's behind the surface. So I'm getting behind the surface of the client to see the abstraction that they create about their life. What part of you is speaking? So this is a very abstract thing in psychotherapy. You could say that people are made up of different subpersonalities, right? And those subpersonalities include feeling, sensing, intuition, and thinking. So which part of that process is speaking? Is it the feeling side, sensing side? What is talking right now? And the thing with intuition is I might be listening to your story, and I notice that something may seem kind of important in your story. You're talking about your past, and you may think you're just talking about your life story, like I'm just telling you my life story. But I stop and I say, what you said, that sounds significant. Because I noticed that they changed their voice somehow, or I noticed that I just noticed something that may seem like it's very important. And I'm kind of framing that in kind of a question, right? That is significant, but I'm not saying in a very definitive tone. I'm saying, that sounds like it's significant, right? Can we talk about that? So it's reading into the clients. I'm not just taking things on the surface. So a healthy psychotherapy session is a balance between these components. And you could see, you can almost look at the history of psychotherapy as areas that prioritize certain ways of looking at the world. And they're all very valid ways. So these come from very significant psychotherapists, these movements in psychotherapy. And I think right now, there are a bunch of tools at my disposal, right? Because I learned from all these psychotherapists, so I could bring everything together, because I like to see people as a cohesive whole. So we begin with the bottom here, the intuition. A lot of the primary psychotherapists are intuitive types, like Freud, you say Jung, right? Adler. There's something intuitive about them. They're looking at the psychodynamic. They're looking at the unconscious process, and they're trying to elucidate insight. So before, in the very earlier stages, people are thinking about, these psychotherapists are thinking about, I'm wondering how unconscious motives are driving behavior. And then the next phase is here, humanistic. There's people who say, well, I would like the psychotherapy process to be more human, like to very, very much take into account people's feelings. So like you could see Freud, I would say the stereotype of Freud. The stereotype of Freud is that he's, you're laying down on a couch and he's not even looking at you, right? And so there's something unequal about that, or he's the authority who's telling you things about yourself, right? The actual picture is more complicated than that. He's actually was a very warm psychotherapist. But you could see that someone formed the bridge between the intuitive to the feeling. Carl Jung was part of that, where he got it so that the client is facing the therapist as equals, and then they're collaborating together. And the idea here is in humanistic is, so long as I foster the right environment for the client in an emotional way, that I provide them with unconditional positive regard, that I give them the sense that they could express themselves, even the darkest aspect of themselves, without judgment. If I provide that kind of environment, that supportive environment, then that person could heal, right? They're not given a good environment, so they almost like a plant that's growing. Like if you put the seed in good soil and you water the plant's going to grow well, and the plant's going to largely grow on its own. And this is where Carl Rogers comes in with person-centered therapy, being able to foster that kind of environment. And this idea of just looking at feelings and your needs, like identifying what your feelings are and your needs are. And you think, wow, this is like very, like, I wish my psychotherapists, if they have a very humanistic bent, I wish that they could just tell me what to do, right? But some strange reason, just by identifying emotion and providing that space for it, unconditional support for it, the client transforms a lot, like even on its own. And that's my experience. My experience is I actually like to use all different kinds of therapy. So my own therapy is both directive and non-directive. But even the non-directive aspect, that creating that environment, there's some sort of magic to it. And it doesn't matter if the person's the thinking type or feeling type. When people have that place for that emotion, there's some sort of strange way that they almost magically find their answers, because they never had been in that place before where they're really truly listened to and their emotions are given that kind of space. So that's a transformation. And then the next phase is the cognitive revolution. So you start with rational motive behavioral therapy, and that's with Albert Ellis. And he says, I would like psychotherapy to be more directive. Like when I'm with Carl Rogers, he's a nice guy, but I don't feel like my therapy is going anywhere. And then, so what he did was that he felt like when he was with the humanistic group, when he's getting humanistic therapy from Carl Rogers, that the therapy is not going anywhere, and he feels like psychodynamic therapy definitely does not go anywhere. it takes years and years to get here. So he wants something that's more directive. And what's directive? Thinking. Thinking is directive because it's drawing conclusion. You're going from A to B to C, right? You're actively changing your thinking pattern and changing what's irrational to what is rational. And then recently, like you have the integration of like Eastern Western practices. So you have sensing here, where now the therapists are more interested in somatic approaches and how the body, becoming aware of your body is very important in psychotherapy. So you could say like there's psychotherapists who very much favor one thing over the other. So they're feeling, and then some of them are more the thinking based, some are more the intuitive based, and some are more the sensing based. Others are more eclectic, others integrate. I'm someone who integrates. And there's also different versions. So you could just say that some people are very purely about what's rational. But later on, like CBT starts to incorporate other perspectives. So they create some room for thinking, for feeling, and also sensing. And that's why it's called like our rational motive behavioral therapy. It's called rational motive behavioral therapy because there's emotion and behavior involved, emotion and behavior. So Shrikant, do you have any comments?
Yes, absolutely. When you're approaching a person, how do you decide? I mean, you have this entire toolkit. How do you decide which of these toolkits to use?
Yes, that's a really good question. And the funny thing is that often the client knows. So don't think that because there's a client that's very thinking that they're coming in looking for CBT thinking approach. Often they're as much the case, they say, well, my thinking is very well developed. I want to explore my feeling. And I definitely see that. And then there's other clients feeling who want to explore their thinking more. And so there's many different combinations here. There's the thinking type that wants CBT, there's the thinking type that wants more of the emotion and they recognize it as the weakness. And then there's also me, the client who thinks they want one thing, but I could sense at an unconscious level they want something else. So I'm going to start to bring that up more.
So what you're saying is that, one case is when the client explicitly asks for something. And
Right.
the other case is that what you're doing is that you're saying, what do I think the client needs, and just provide that.
And that part's interesting because I always hold to the client's agenda, but what I'm holding to is their deeper agenda. So I'm reading what they actually are bringing into the session. So they may not say, I want to have that more thinking aspect, but they're always referring to it in some sort of, like you could tell that their soul is kind of lacking that aspect. And then I start to put that in. So they may not agree with the label of it, but that's the reality.
Excellent. So let's go on. I'll ask questions as we go on. Go ahead.
Okay. So here's the feeling ones. The feeling sphere, the humanistic sphere, is in itself very powerful effect. And I feel like some CBT therapists, they're kind of like their criticisms of this area are a bit unfounded in a way, because there's something about really knowing feelings in themselves without the interruption of rationale or thinking that's actually very healing. And there's something about unconditional positive regard that's also very healing too. So like very strict CBT therapists would say, well, you accept yourself and I accept you, right? That's rationally the best that you could do. You can't expect unconditional positive regard, right? But there's something about fostering that environment for the client that allows them to have that space to be able to creatively come up with solutions. There's almost like kind of a breathing room for them, like to have that kind of support. And also the idea that they also can cultivate compassion for themselves. So there's unconditional positive regard and compassionate presence, and the idea of catharsis, that you talk out your problems and someone's listening, and without like using thinking to provide you corrections in any sort of way, that is very healing for people. And the mistake here is thinking that the reason why this works is to get emotion out of the way so that your thinking can start working. Like people think, oh, I just need to get my emotions out of the way. Can you help me get them out of the way so that my mind can start working again? It actually doesn't work that way. Emotions, the feeling side is just as important as the thinking side, because it gets to another understanding of things that thinking does not. Emotions allow you to be able to access what your needs are in a way that your thinking side could only superficially get to. You could rationalize, but for some reason, it doesn't actually get to it. It's actually very superficial. And that's why when you try to push your emotions away and you try to live rationally, it seems like you're not getting anywhere. You're operating very slowly. Your emotional side is pushing back. And it's not pushing back because it's ridiculous or stupid, but it's because it speaks to something deep within you that you're not accessing only through rationale, right? So
Leon, I mean, it's interesting. I was looking at all these four. We have had presentations on each of these four over the past 3 months.
Yes.
I mean, this, Carl Rogers and this approach of authentic relating is a theme that we have kept coming back to in our meetup.
Yes.
Because even outside the context of psychotherapy, just in human relations, this is an amazingly powerful thing. Because what it does is that most people carry all these kind of personas, all kinds of kind of misconceptions about themselves. And so it's personas trying to pretend to be something, plus all kinds of misconceptions. And if they just let go of that and try to authentically see each other, then both parties end up kind of dissolving those misconceptions and kind of letting go of those personas, at least for some time, so they can see what is going on. They will get an insight into what is going on.
Yes. Yes. This is a very incredibly powerful approach. So even with clients, just naming these emotions that are here. So they're talking. It says, oh, it sounds like you're apprehensive, right? So I say like, I'm giving an MBTI, just say theoretically, I'm giving an MBTI psychotherapy presentation. And then I talk to my therapist and I have about the presentation, and the therapist helps me to identify the feelings I have. I have like afraid, apprehensive, worried, and just listing that, just one word. And I'm feeling a bit of, I'm anxious, or I'm tense about it. Just even saying that is relieving in itself. So what you resist persists. Like you use your thinking to say, okay, then do this, but do this, right? It fights back harder. And you say, okay, this is about getting your emotions out of the way. No, because when I can identify the emotion, I could know what my needs are. So when I'm feeling anxious, I would like to have a sense of appreciation. So these are needs, appreciation. I would like to have a sense of being respected, and that my audience could empathize with me, right? And that they could understand me. And even though I'm just role playing here, like I never talked to a psychotherapist, right? I wasn't very anxious before this talk. I already actually feel relieved. So the therapist just says, so you are feeling anxious and you would like to have that sense of understanding. Simple as that, no correction. It's just, this is a form of reflection. And knowing that need lets you to understand what your values are. Like, how can you go for what you want in your life? And these are universal human needs. So actually they make sense in their way. So then you could think about like, how can I meet that need? Like this is where the thinking comes in. But if you try to rationalize yourself through this process, it doesn't work. So what I'm saying here is providing that pure space for feeling is important. And now, but there's limitations because I feel like the critiques that the CBT therapists they have are actually correct because clients, I find that there's some certain clients that are very good emotional intuitive processors. They're often feeling types, but they are less inclined to structured action or execution. And then so they're stuck in a way. They're stuck because they're not in touch with that other aspect of themselves, and that exists. That's important. So you could this whole entire feelings and needs exercise. It's created by nonviolent communication, NVC. Very powerful approach, but the person who founded it said that he's basically believes the thinking process is not important here, right? Because he saw how powerful it is in itself just to tap into feeling. But I think that the thinking process is very important, actually, because then you could process things, but then what do you do? Like, what do you do about it? Or like, what's the way you could engage with your body too? And those are just as valid. So it leaves out a lot. And so this is where CBT comes in. And CBT says, okay, I'm gonna make the sessions with my clients very structured. This is very different from the last one. The last one was very, kind of very unstructured approach that works very effectively. But here, the session is going to be very structured, and I'm going to identify what the irrational belief is when someone encounters something that is very troubling for them in their life. What is their irrational belief? And then what kind of consequences are there emotionally and behaviorally? So say, I think if I give a presentation, if I don't do it well, it's the end of the world, right? An if-then statement here. And my consequence emotionally is that I get very anxious, or my behavior thing is I start to procrastinate and not create my slides, right? So we clarify that, and then the therapist interestingly disputes what you're saying. Disputes, okay, well, if then statements are very black and white. It's like 100% of the time, if an if happens, then a then happens. Let's really let's collect evidence. Is that really true, right? And then you create your new effective rational belief. You say, okay, now I take into account these disputations. I could behave and emote differently right now. Yeah, and when I say this is great, this is pretty good. And this is why this is called the cognitive revolution, because it's a very profound, different way of psychotherapy compared to the psychodynamic school, and also person-centered emotional, like a more emotion-based approach. It's much more structured, much more directive. It could seem that the client has quicker results, right? But I feel like the picture is actually more complex than that. It's more complex than this. Because, and it also seems kind of like well-balanced, because you see in this model, it takes into account thinking, feeling, behavior, right? There's thinking here, and then there's the emotions. I'll show you in the next slide. Basically, it's saying you have encounter adversity, you think a certain way, so your emotions and behaviors result from that. So you change your thinking and you have new emotions and behaviors. Does that seem like well-rounded, right? Because you're including everything else. But there's one thing that is very critically missing in this piece, because the basic premise here is thoughts determine feeling and behavior. So everything is about how do I change my thoughts so that my feelings and behaviors can be different. And if you look at, I really love Albert Ellis, REBT, but if you see his therapy sessions, at least the ones that he presents, that he gives to the, makes obvious in the public, he doesn't explore emotions that much. Like he asks, what are your consequential emotions? But there's something like this whole entire sphere of emotions where you purely explore emotions for itself and let the client express itself, that is more like artistic and more, it's healing in a way that this whole process, in a simplified way, if it's done in a very simplified way, cannot get to. Because for some reason, in a session, like if you do a pure CBT approach, it looks like there's progress right away. Because it's like, okay, you establish this irrational belief. So, and these are your emotions and behaviors that are different. Now we look at, okay, you think differently now. If you buy these new thoughts that make much more sense, think differently, it's like, ta-da, then your behaviors are different. And then they come in the next week. So it looks like you made so much progress with the client. You went from A to B much more quickly than in psychodynamic theory and person-centered approach. They return next week with the same problem. Why? There's something missing, that deep emotional component, the deep intuitive component. And so what happens, what I find with the CBT, if it's done in a very pure CBT kind of way, if it's, now CBT has evolved over time and includes a lot of the other elements. What happens is that it's very forebrain, it's very top-down approach. So a lot of clients who are more prone to rationale or thinking, they feel like they're stuck in their mind somehow. And then they feel very trapped in their head. And if they do a pure CBT approach, it just feels like it's a lot of work. So you might have all been in that place. It doesn't matter if you're feeling type or thinking type, in which it seems like you're working very, very hard to make changes in your life. You're acting as rationally as possible. You're trying to structure your life to make sense. And it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. It seems like it's just a lot of pressure, right? That's because you're only activating a part of the brain. And it does get to the other parts of the brain, like emotions and behavior, but it always starts with the forebrain. That's actually very taxing because that's, you're trying to orchestrate everything here. And you could see that in, brain research, creativity is kind of happens when the executive function could shut down a bit. So you're losing that creative potential because the executive function is strong. So you can almost like a government, like having a very balanced government, right? You don't want to have it to be too like big government or too little government in a way, right? I don't want to get into politics here. That's not my specialty. Don't take any political advice from me. I'm just talking about as a metaphor, right? If everything's just very top down, it's kind of inefficient in a way. So you can almost look at, so clients get very trapped in their head, they're under a lot of pressure. And what happens is that the thinking starts to become a pseudo manager. So it seems like the thinking side is the wise side because the thinking side makes sense. It makes sense. It's trying to create structure that will make a solution, like it's working towards a solution. But if it's not healthy, it becomes a pseudo manager. It's actually something that's controlling the other sides, including the emotional side, right? It's giving room for it. So like in CBT, it says, there are emotions, right? But you're always trying to change it first through your thinking. So what happens is that the emotions start to become exiled and the manager thinking starts to lock the exiled emotions into jail or lock your sensory perception or your body into jail. Carl Jung talks about people like there's different kinds of thinking. There's extrovert thinking, introverted thinking. With the extrovert thinking, they kind of have a very rigid formula for life. One size fits all. And a formula that changes over time. So it starts to have adaptations given different conditions in society. Um, but it basically, when it becomes extreme, it starts to exile the other elements in the personality, such as the emotional aspect, such as they kind of completely ignore the emotional or sensory aspect of their own life. And what happens is that when you exile it, it doesn't go away. It's still there. It's still a part of you. So it starts to act unconsciously. So this takes me to the next part, because I want to say that there's the thinking being the manager, right? But you can almost say the feeling side could be a manager too. Like if you think emotions are prime and most important, then their thinking starts to become exiled and locked up. And it starts, but it still has a voice, but since you're not giving it any airtime, it's going to act unconsciously. So I want to get into more Jungian territory here.
One question.
Yes.
What is a firefighter in that diagram?
Oh, I'm afraid you're gonna ask. I was thinking, what if he asked this question about the firefighter? I want to say this is from a model called internal family systems. I thought it's a very useful metaphor. So I don't want to speak on behalf of the internal family systems. I like, I very much use internal family systems in my practice, but I just saw there's a part of it that could explain this theory very well, right? And but it's only like involving the Excel and manager part.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Can you, in one sentence, tell me what the firefighter is? Otherwise, I won't be able to get that diagram out of my head.
This is in order to clear Sri Kant's head in mind space. So the manager is more proactive approaches to keep the exiles at bay. Firefighters are more reactive. So like you could say a manager is, I'm going to try to keep myself perfect, present well so that I don't have that feeling of not being good enough, the exile part. The firefighter says, okay, now I'm starting to feel like I'm not good enough. What I'm going to do, I'm going to start to overeat. I'm going to start to drink. I'm going to start to whatever. There's different kinds of things involved. Right?
Got it. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now I can.
Yeah. Okay, so there's this Carl Jung in his book Psychological Types. He talks about the different types, and he talks about this concept of ego fusion. So if there's a sensing type and their ego is so like bound to the sensing process that they almost become just purely sensing, right? Everyone has all the aspects here, thinking, feeling, intuition as part of their personality, but say if someone's sensing and they ignore all the other aspects, there is an ego fusion here. So he talks about like there's an expert sensing type, and the expert sensing type likes to be able to actualize things, makes them reified. And in a normal type, there's a balance. So like someone who's an expert sensing type, they might have like fine taste in things, right? But it's all like within healthy bounds. But then when sensing starts to predominate, then they're always sensation seeking. So they don't even see people anymore. They see like a person for sexual gratification, or they always pursuing some sort of way to intensify their sensory experience, because you can almost like at the thinking and feeling processes as ethical processes, because they both come to a certain kind of judgment. Sensing intuition is amoral, not immoral, not like bad in itself, but it's just taking in information. But if you're just sensing or just intuiting, so Carl Jung talks about the pure intuitive type, like if they only go, if their ego, their sense of self is completely fused with intuition, then that person's very much regarded as an amoral person who's always an opportunist, because they're always seeing possibilities and how can they make use of the possibilities. And they put other people's lives in danger because for the sake of pursuit of possibilities, just because they can realize a business idea, for instance. but not just other people's welfare, but their own welfare as well. So they're completely ignoring the sensing side, like taking care of the body just for the sake of this. So in a normal type, everyone has these problems, these types of problems. So meaning like an average intuiting type is going to have problems with sensing. Like there's probably intuitive types here who like, you know, you want to go to sleep because you want to read another Wikipedia article, right? And that's all pretty normal, right? There's also an extreme version, which, you know, they might be like a really big speculator, something like that, you know, willing to put like the economy into danger so that they could realize an interesting idea in terms of business. There's also like, if the ego gets fused with feeling, then he talks about the introvert feeling type as almost having the sense of morbid self-love, because they have that feeling. It's almost like feeling, but feeling for feeling's sake. It's kind of makes that feeling kind of almost like it's inauthentic in a way. It's like very, it's feeling for feeling's sake. There's no like other purpose behind it. And then he also talks about the thinking type. They can't separate the self from ideas in pure form. So they think and they come up with all sorts of deductions, but it's like deductions upon deductions, but they fail to relate that back to reality. So that's why it's important to balance things out. If you balance thinking out with sensing, like with the real world, then you're going to have good ideas because ideas are reflecting reality. But then if the thinking starts to take over, then it starts to become more of an abstraction that's not actually related to the world. So think about this in this way. This is actually about balance, but not in a very, it's not simply about finding the middle way, or like even Aristotle saying like, there may be like a perfect place, like if you have two poles, maybe what's good is like 3/4 of the way towards one direction. We're not talking about that. Actually, the more you develop the other sides, your primary side starts to become more real in a way. Like it's actually, by developing your opposite, your primary way of operating actually furthers itself. The thinking starts to make more sense when you include feeling. The thinking starts to become sounder when you include feeling. The thinking starts to reflect reality more when you include sensing. So it's almost like the thinking becomes even more real. But then the thinking becomes a weird abstraction if it's just on its own. Feeling too. Feeling like if it's like, you know, you watch it like a really cheesy movie, like obviously the director's like maybe gone into an extreme feeling mode. It almost seems kind of inauthentic because it's like feeling for feeling's sake. It's not, there's some missing component to it. So this is about actually making your primary function more real in a way by allowing the other sides to develop. So how do you do this? How do you do this? So Carl Jung talks about these processes, and you can almost like observe these processes. This is what he calls transcendence. So even though you're a primary thinking type, you could transcend that process a bit and observe your thinking process, observe it happening. And if you say you're a primary thinking type, you could observe your thinking happening, you could observe your sensing happening and feeling happening. And you just say, oh, I notice my thinking is doing this. I notice my sensing is doing this, right? And this causes a diffusion between the ego and the process itself. So here, there's a fusion between the process and this, such that you almost become the process itself. Here, you are observing all your processes. So this is not the same as saying that you transcend type, right? People are usually mainly driven by a primary process. They're either like thinking or feeling, and then there's a certain kind of ranking. So say like this person's mainly a sensing type, they have thinking as their secondary, feeling as their tertiary, intuitive as their fourth, but they could observe the different processes play out. I feel like, and this does not mean that then you could transcend it, meaning you can no longer sense or think or feel or intuit, you're beyond that. No, I feel like these functions are like breathing. You can't help but breathe, right? I'm always breathing, but I could start paying attention to my breath, right? I could make my breath longer and then shorter, right? I can make different kinds of breaths. So there's ways you have influence over these functions, right? So it's like the same thing with emotions, right? You can't get rid of your emotions, but you have influence on your emotions. You have influence on how these functions are expressed. And if I exercise, my breath becomes better, right? So your function could actually become stronger and healthier, and even the weaker ones can, right? So they're all necessary processes. So if you're primary sensing type, maybe like sensing is like breathing, right? And then maybe like feeling is almost like going to the bathroom. You don't go like as often as you breathe, but it's still like very much part of the process. So this is a way you separate from the function and you observe it happening. And doesn't mean that you completely control it. No, it's happening and you recognize its existence. You're aware of it, but you separate from it in the sense that you could see it almost like from a meta view. So you're looking at you're not no longer infusing yourself as this or this or this, but you're noticing it and you are validating that each one has an important voice. Each one is calling out to you because they have something important to say. So how do you get them to speak? How do you get them to speak in a healthy manner? So this is where this next slide comes in. So again, what happens if someone prioritizes feeling in itself at the expense of all other ways of being? The thinking happens in the shadow. It's exiled, right? So it's happening. So he talks about feeling types who like, if they prioritize feeling at the expense of thinking, the thinking comes out as very critical judgments, but they're not even aware that they're making critical judgments towards the people that they love. So they love these people, but then they make these very harsh judgments about it, but they don't even realize it's happening because they're so identified with the feeling process. And also with there's thinking types who feeling starts to show up in ways. So like he talks about there's thinking types who live very rigidly by a formula, but then the feelings start to show up like they start to, in certain ways where they start to, they're willing to lie and they're willing to cheat in order to get their way, but they're not even aware that it's happening. Or there's thinking types who are so unaware of their feeling side that they easily fall prey to flattery, like people using feeling manipulation tactics on them because they feel like they're so rational that they're actually very susceptible to emotional manipulation tactics. I just want to quickly go over these. Like, if feeling occurs at the absence of other functions, it becomes a contentless, passionate. Jung said, thinking becomes abstraction to the nth degree, or that's introverted thinking. Extroverted thinking becomes a bunch of indigestible facts. This person just collects facts and evidence, and he doesn't try to, or she doesn't try to bring them together in any meaningful way. Or so a key thing he says, like, no function can be entirely eliminated, only distorted, right? So you can't eliminate the thinking, but if you can't eliminate it, it actually just becomes a distorted form, which operates in the background. So Carl Jung says, where wisdom reigns, there's no conflict between thinking and feeling. So if you could validate the existence of both and know that they are both sound ways to reason, then you actually become healthier. Because what you could do here is that you could almost imagine your feeling side sitting on a chair and your thinking side sitting on another chair, and they're having a discussion with one another. You allow the feeling side to completely express itself first without any interruption from the thinking side, right? So in a pure CBT way, the thinking side is going to immediately start coming in and trying to like correct the feelings. No, you allow the feelings to completely express itself while the thinking side here is listening in and hearing the feeling side. After the feeling side has completely spoken, then you get into that rational mode, the thinking mode. The first thing you do is repeat back what the feeling side has said. So the thinking side repeats back what it heard the feeling side said, just to make sure that the communication has gone across. Then the thinking side can speak its own point of view, its own rational point of view. And then the feeling side empathizes with it by repeating back what the thinking side says. So the feeling side is realizing the soundness of thinking. The thinking side is empathizing with feeling. The feeling side is empathizing with thinking, and the thinking side is realizing the soundness, the rationale behind the feeling side through this process. And doesn't, I like to have the client to talk to him or herself, like actually look at the chair across from them and speak, right? You even get the client to switch chairs, go from one chair to the other, speaking the sides. But this doesn't necessarily mean that this happens like immediately, meaning 1 minute of this, 1 minute of that, 1 minute of this, 1 minute of that. It could be one day of the feeling and allowing yourself to have that side validated. And the next day, then you start to develop that thinking side. So this is a way to bring these two sides into existence. So in pure CBT form, it's trying to always go back to thinking first and then to feeling. But in this case, you're providing a complete space for feeling and a complete space for thinking to exist first, and also bring them together in a meaningful discussion. So I think everyone can identify with the idea that they're made up of these sub-personalities in their head and they're always like fighting with one another, right? This is a way to start to get them to have a discourse.
So Leon, this is really fascinating. We did a whole meetup on this idea in the context of writing, because
Yes.
if you're writing, there are two things you're trying to do. You're trying to kind of keep things very clear, objective, well-structured, but at the same time, you're trying to make sure that it is as creative as possible, as flowing as possible, that leverages all the intuitions that you have. And what happens is that most of the times, whenever you're trying to write creatively, if your thinking side comes in, analytical side comes in and starts to criticize it, the creative side is kind of bottles up and nothing gets done. Or when your analytical side is doing its thing, if the feeling side says, no, I don't like that, that doesn't work either. So the simple idea in writing of kind of going through these shuttling back and forth between these two faculties, saying, okay, now I'm just going to say, okay, what structure needs to be done? I'm just going to engage my analytical mind to see what structure. And then you just hand it over to the creative side. Now write on this, whatever you feel like. I'm not going to criticize, just write it out. Then keep it aside, come back and say, okay, somebody else has written this. What's wrong with this? How can I make it better? And just edit the hell out of that. And just keep doing that as a way of doing that. So it's a similar kind of idea.
It is, and it's a lot like that process. And it is interesting, like your own self, your kind of like your sense of self at a higher level knows about this process. So it could feel it out. So when you're in that feeling phase and the thinking side is coming in too early, it's going to sense it, because now you're going to sense that rebuff from that emotion side. But if you allow that feeling side to fully express itself, and then the thinking side, you could almost feel like yourself is allowing for that, because it's like, okay, it's time. And it's also the case when you are in your feeling side for too long, yourself is like, no, it's giving you a signal, even through your body sense. It's like you're allowing yourself to sink into this for too long. And then, so your sense of self knows. And you can almost, so I'm gonna take this to a different level, new level, and that's idea of integration of therapies. So I want the feeling, like almost like the feeling side and thinking side, the humanistic therapy to be sitting on one side and CBT on the other. So I think what a lot of paradigms do, so a new paradigm comes into existence because it sees the limitations of the previous paradigm. First paradigm shows up, but it's good, but then there's something missing in it. New paradigm shows up, it sees a problem, right? So it creates a new way and it rejects the old way. And it keeps going along this path of a new paradigm shows up rejecting all the previous paradigms. But then it always seems insufficient because when you reject the previous paradigms, you're missing some component. So what the new paradigm does is that it tries to integrate the other ones by saying, okay, as CBT, I'm going to make room for emotions and behaviors. But then it still seems insufficient in a way because every paradigm has a starting point. And with a rational paradigm, the starting point is always rational. And it's going to always miss a component that the previous paradigms have. Like if it's a more feeling-based paradigm, just because it's starting from that emotional starting point, it realizes something that the rational paradigm cannot realize, even though it includes the emotional side, and also vice versa as well. And that's why with the future paradigm, the future paradigm is to integrate all the previous paradigms instead of trying to find one paradigm that could supersede the others and become superior to the other paradigms. How you could bring all these paradigms together so you're looking at through different lenses of human existence. So this is what I like to do in my therapy, is to have this sort of balance, not just speak from one paradigm. And so this is the same thing with sensing and intuition. And this is different because thinking and feeling and intuition are more like, you could do it while you're sitting in one place. Sensing is about action. So sensing, when it comes to therapy, I want to immediately find some way to activate them in terms of their behavior, or to have them notice what's going on in their body in the moment. Like what's happening right now? Where do you notice it in your body right now when you are saying this, right? I want them to get into being in touch with their body. And even like, for instance, I have clients, for example, who they want to do something that's creative in their life, but they can't because they're so stuck in their heads. They're stuck in the intuitive side of things, right? So what I do is I say, okay, so you want to play the guitar. Why don't you bring the guitar into the session right now? So they actually have the guitar and they said, well, this is the first time I touched my guitar in over a year or years, and this guitar is just sitting across on the other side of the room. I wouldn't touch it. So I asked them, so how is it like right now how is it like when you have the guitar on your lap right now? And he say, I have a feeling of regret because I did not actually pursue playing guitar. And I say, okay, can you play for me? And they strum it, and immediately they feel better, immediately. Because there's something about taking action that solves thinking, feeling, and intuition right away. So a lot of clients, they get into thinking, feeling, intuition. They could talk through all these things. They come into pretty marvelous insights. They get in touch with their emotions, but they're still trapped in the same process over and over because so say they want to pursue something creative in their life, but they don't. They can talk about their feelings and their thoughts about it and come to profound insights about themselves, about their relationship with their creative process, but only when they pick up the guitar, something magical happens. It's almost as if just by doing that, the thoughts and feelings that are negative, they disappear, right? There's something, and I bet you have all experienced that before. Like you've been talking about something, you have a lot of insight over something, and that's great. That's valid, right? It's not only valid, but it's helpful to have that kind of insight. But only when you do that thing, it seems like it got rid of your negative thoughts and feelings. It's not because you try to think about it differently, like in the CBT kind of way. I'm just trying to think about it differently. It's not because I could talk about my emotions and and I could feel better about it, right? Because then the emotions come back, the thoughts come back. You do the thing, it those negative thoughts and feelings disappear. So I want to go back and forth between insight and the action, because action itself does not mean much without the insight, right? It's good to have that sense of meaning in life, because even if you did that creative thing, right? What was that whole purpose of it? Or how do you find purpose in that time when you were stuck not doing that creative thing? There is actually a meaning behind it, but it's up to us to, it's our choice to come to our insights. It's our choice to take action or not take action. And whatever path you go in life, you could always find some sort of insight behind it, right? At the same time, insight's not everything, because then you'll only be developing the intuitive side of your mind. So this last slide here kind of brings it together. So this is your sense of self, and I want you to explore feeling in itself without interruption from any other process, thinking in itself without interruption from any other process, sensing in itself without interruption, intuition without any interruption. Then I want you to go to, from your feeling side, explore your sensing, intuition, and thinking. Just like in CBT, from your thinking side, explore your feeling, sensing, intuition. What is your thinking side's way of being able to work with these things? How is your body able to help with intuition, thinking, and feeling? I was just talking about that, right? You take the action, it helps with these. Intuition, how does that help? So all purely by itself, how does this side go to this? And then after we do that, we get the two sides to talk with one another, feeling and thinking like partners, talking with one another, sensing, intuition like partners, talking with one another. So this is kind of the idea of bringing the MBTI together with psychotherapy, using all these ways I've been working with therapists. With therapy, I got to see how basically like psychotherapists, they have their own MBTI types. They're gonna favor a certain kind of approach, right? And then they're gonna have their way of being able to deal with their own functions too, their own sensing, intuition, thinking. So this is very much about psychotherapists themselves, not just about how they're doing psychotherapy. So for me, I would like to be able to bring this all together, like to say, Albert Ellis, Carl Rogers, Sigmund Freud, you all came to very significant findings. And I believe that what you say is valuable. Can we bring this together, right? Can we bring this together and bring them to the table and talk to them as equals? Because this is actually symbolic of our own psychological process. Inside, we have our own Sigmund Freud, we have our own Albert Ellis, we have our own Carl Rogers. Because there's these personalities in us that one side cares about the feeling, one side cares about the thinking, right? One side cares about the intuition. You bring them, side cares about the sensing. You bring them all together in a conference table so that they could talk with one another in a way that validates one another's perspectives and brings a meaningful conversation that allows for integration.
Excellent, Leon. Thank you very much. So, folks, we're going to start with Q&A now. So we've got 4 rules in order to manage the Q&A. Number 1, when you have a question, go ahead and type exclamation mark in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom. Rule number 2, keep on topic. Rule number 3, be brief. There's a lot of people who have a lot of interesting things to say and interesting questions to ask. And number 4, feel free to disagree with anything, but do so courteously. What we're going to do at this stage is we are just going to take questions. So be very brief, no statements, just questions at this point. We'll take all the questions, then we are going to do breakout rooms so we can have plenty of discussion there. And after the breakout rooms, we're going to come back, and that is the time you can give your own takeaways. And you can also ask a question at that point. All right, so let me see. Great, a lot of people have lined up here. Let's see. First one is Anna and Kevin. Anna, go ahead.
Yes, I was wondering, what do you think are the main limitations of this framework? Like, what do you think are the main problems?
This framework. So one thing, if it's not done well, just like with other psychotherapies, right? It also becomes a very limiting perspective. Like it's a limiting perspective to say, it's time to do a catch-all, right? A catch-all, if you're not in tune with what the client wants, if you're just trying everything, you're not really relating with the client.
Okay, next up is Kevin, Darren, Gene, and MP. Kevin, go ahead.
Oh, my question is about type change. For example, I'm type ENTP. Since a year ago, could it be changed to ISTF, total opposite, or it's a mixture between or even same frame, maybe same task, use this, I'm active this type. Another event, maybe active another type. Thank you.
Yeah, so, well, Carl Jung would say that type is the problem. So he created a type system, but he says type is the problem, right? It looks like really from observation, people don't change types, but they very much change their brain wiring. So you can almost look at the types almost like a hardware. You're a hardware, and then you could change what the software is. So you could have an INTJ who grows up, and because of their education and because of upbringing, but also what they bring into their own lives, you start to have areas of the brain that start to light up that are not typical of a typical INTJ.
Next up is going to be Darren, Gene, MP, and Clara. Darren, go ahead.
Sure. So a person figures out how they're like categorized with the different letters. Like, what's the next initial step that they would need to do?
After they know like the type that they fall into.
Mm-hmm.
Is this like in terms of psychotherapy?
I mean, just in terms of just like improving themselves or doing stuff that would be, you know, like beneficial to being more successful as an individual, kind of thing.
Yeah, so I want to go with a balance between a structured and unstructured approach here, because if someone becomes enthusiastic about type, just like a child growing up, to start discovering something new, you want to give them their own space. You don't want to let them know everything. So, and then they're gonna like find out things on their own. They're gonna develop their own interest in it, and they're gonna fall into, there's different phases of being interested in anything, right? First, you're very like enthusiastic, right? And you might start to think a lot of people fall in this phase where your type is superior than the other types because you really like your own type. And later on, you go into a phase where you learn about the other types and you start to see like, actually, these are very different ways of looking at reality, and that they're all equal in a way. So there's a maturing to this, just like a child maturing to an adult.
Let me rephrase the question and restate the question in another way. There are a lot of people here who are not that familiar with MBTI. So let's take, let's say that they take a test, they figure out their type. What does that do for them? How do they use that?
Oh, so it's useful because you get to see your way of looking at the world. I think first of all, when you find the right profile for you, the one that actually resonates, it's a healing process on its own. Kind of like what I just said with Carl Rogers and person-centered therapy, is you feel very validated that you think you're the only one who thinks a certain kind of way. So you get that validation. After that phase, then you start to develop insights about yourself. You could go online and you could connect with other types, and you could learn from other types or learn from people who are representatives of your own type. Like, what are some ways that I could develop as my type, and also to see my blind spots? And just knowing that there's other ways of thinking allows you to cultivate areas which are blind spots. It's actually a really huge advantage to know the MBTI, because your brain naturally automatically operates a certain way, and to know about these other ways of operating, you could jumpstart different ways of thinking in yourself. It could also become a huge crutch, meaning it starts to validate everything that you are doing, and there's no reason why you need to do anything different because this is your type, and other types are inferior. So I don't need to improve. So people do take these two different directions.
Wonderful. I just want to say one thing here. And my answer to that, I mean, the reason I'm interested in, the cognitive functions is that it does two things for me. Number one, it allows me, it enables me greater self-awareness of where I'm strong and where I'm weak. Because just by putting myself against these different axes, I can say, oh, here I'm a little bit better, here I'm a little bit worse. So it improves self-awareness. That's one. Number two, it allows me to understand other people a little better. Many times you just assume that other people are like you, and that's a very common fallacy. And this allows you to say, oh, the person is operating differently because they are focused this way rather than way I'm focused. So those are the two things. And folks who are new to MBTI, you have a treat this weekend. This is only the first of the 3 presentations we have on MBTI. The second one is going to be tomorrow at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. That's going to be Aiden Moore talking about the Jungian basis of Myers-Briggs. And then at 5 o'clock, I'm going to have a panel of about half a dozen to dozen people who have been using MBTI. And I'm going to ask them that single question. How do you use MBTI in your life? And I'm sure all of them will have amazing things to say. And this is not only going to be useful for anybody who wants a good introduction to MBTI, but to anybody who is really, if you've been using MBTI for a long time, you'll get to hear lots of different perspectives. If you want to ramp up on this, Leon has a channel called Type Tips. You can watch some of his videos. I'm also very fond of Michael Pierce's videos on different types. So you can use that to kind of get started. Okay, if you're familiar. All right. So sorry about the interruption here. Let me go ahead. It's going to be Jean, MP, Clara, Donna, Michael next. Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, personally, I found this very helpful, especially understand other people, because I found, it's very hard to talk about reasoning with a feeler. You have to build all the relationship. And my younger son actually is a feeler.
Jean, what's your question?
Yeah, my question actually is, I actually observed, I actually asked in another Stoicism group, they actually talk more about the reasoning part. And like, if you have to avoid things, and I was like, is that repressing your feeling? What Carl Jung was said, is this practice have that drawback because you only focus on the reasoning part, totally ignore the feeling part? Is that flashback? That's maybe, I said, that's maybe the reason we have this scandals in Catholic Church. Anyway, so I want your question on that, because I think your idea about integrate both sides is very important.
Yeah, I think that is an important point, and thank you for that. So there's it's true, like the tendency is to suppress the unconscious side if one side is kind of overly developed. What I find interesting is that when people come to therapy, they already seem to be coming in with awareness of a problem. So they often are clear that there's a side of themselves that they're not developing.
All right. So next is going to be MP, Clara, Donna, Michael, Linda, Julie, Mike, Jyoti, Jairo, and Rupali. Folks, keep your questions short. MP, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, Leon. It's Manju. So thank you for your presentation. So, in kind of just reviewing, I think just your presentation so far, it just seemed to me that the thinking was seen as more of the rational process, whereas feeling was more emotional. Is that incorrect on my part?
Well, that's the way it's being defined here. Yeah.
Okay. because I actually practice CBT also. And, you know, I think that beliefs can also be pretty rational. And that's the work that I do. And, you know, and I talk about emotional reasoning also. And, you know, as an INTJ, especially as a female INTJ, you know, I kind of find myself feeling displaced a lot because I don't come off as that feely, accommodating, kind of feminine. Not that all women should be like this. I'm going by very rigid stereotypes based on gender. But I just think that what's been helpful to me is just really talking about the emotional mind, the rational mind, and the wise mind, just to kind of validate those approaches and all those experiences in one's internal processes as they heal or go, you know, try to work through whatever it is that they're working through. But I just, as an INTJ, you know, I do feel. And so I just want to kind of clarify that there's a difference between using concepts as a thinker, as a main function versus something more subjective.
Thank you, Manju.
Thanks.
Okay, go ahead. Next up is going to be Clara, Donna, and Michael. Clara.
Hi, my question, hi, thank you. My question is kind of like what the last person was asking, but I don't think that you clarified really. When I think about like rational or thinking side, I think of like there is some emotional component to there, to that. Like, I mean, insofar as we can separate our logical mind from our emotions completely, there's still like a little bit of overlap. So I mean, like if I'm in a situation where I feel myself being too logical, I could still be a feeling. Does that make sense at all? I guess it's hard to explain.
Yeah, it does make sense. So they're all very much intertwined with one another. So thinking is very much intertwined with feeling processes, and you can almost say that they actually shuttle back and forth. So in the socionics model, they actually talk about like how thinking and feeling could shuttle a lot. I think there's emotions, and then there's feeling, and then there's thinking, right? You could think about emotions, right? And you could feel emotions. So there's a difference. Like it's not the same thing. So the thinking and the emotion is not the same thing, but there's a way of thinking about emotions that could be very healthy. And there's a lot of ways that people don't think about emotions that does not lend itself well to health, right? And they're actually very much linked. It's very important to be able to develop that thinking side and clear reasoning to not only have healthy emotions, but to understand emotions. It could also bring a lot of clarity by putting labels to what the emotional process is. If that makes sense.
Donna, Michael, and Linda next. Donna.
So I was an INF 20 years ago, and now I'm an ENTP. The N was strong then and it's strong now, but all the other ones, axes are sort of more middle. So am I really a ENTP, or am I hiding my INFJ, or was I afraid? I don't know. That's my question.
Yeah. So I see that you will like have clarity about your type. I wouldn't be able to tell like at all from this very brief introduction that you have on yourself. But I think it's normal. Like I think when people are changing types, it's like their consciousness is focusing on the development of a certain kind of function, right? So it's reflecting where our mind is at. And I would say that you could almost say there's certain thinking types who have healthier feeling than a feeling type who's dominantly feeling, but their relationship with their own process is unhealthy. So they may mistake themselves as a feeling type, right? Because they're empathetic. They learn they rationally come to conclusions about how to be able to relate with others' experience, right? And someone who is an undeveloped feeler, they're actually reactive, and that's not healthy. So often I feel like when people are changing types, it's not really they're changing types, they're just focusing on different aspects of their personality that they want to develop.
Okay, next up is Michael. Michael, what's your question?
My question is, as a typical ENTP, my mind is constantly generating all kinds of brilliant new ideas. My weak point and challenge, however, is that I have a tendency to become so fascinated with these thoughts that I don't act. What should I do?
Yeah, so it's a lot like that example with the guitar. So I find like a lot of clients who are lawyers, they're ENTPs, and they're very good at analyzing situations and looking at different possibilities, different interpretations. But in terms of that part of their life which involves the action, there's a way to get into it, in that is to find some way to get even a small amount of action. And if that side is not well developed, get some way you can get that action in. So the thing is, the funny thing with when I'm talking with ENTP clients is they're very good at the insight and the intellectual aspect. So talking more about how to do the action is only causing more of the intellectual insight process to happen. So actually, like, again, with that guitar, like you're taking that action, actually bringing that guitar into session, or I say like outside of session, what is the smallest thing that you could possibly do, right? And what is your response to that piece? Once you do that small thing, you realize your thoughts and the feelings will become different. Take note of that, because then that's gonna reinforce the action later on.
Next up is going to be Linda, Julie, Mike, Jyoti, Jairo, and Rupali. Linda, go ahead.
I have a two-part question. My first question is whether there's a particular type that's considered the healthiest. And my second question is, can we truly change our type? Or are we just deluding ourselves if we think we can by just concentrating on something that's not our strongest type?
Okay, and so the second one is about changing type. I feel like a goldfish right now with the question. So, and then what's the first one again?
Is there a better type? Is one type?
Oh, okay, is there a better type? Yeah. So what I like about the MBTI and Carl Jung's work is that the types are described in a way that shows both their strengths and their weaknesses. So this is the edge I like that has over the 5-factor model. There's great things about the 5-factor model, but it's obviously better to be one side than the other, right? It's better to be open-minded than closed-minded, or any of the other, like, it's better to be kind of easygoing with people than rather, aggressive with people. So that thing has more value laden. The terms are more value laden, but with the MBTI, introversion, extroversion, intuition, sensing, that is by nature neutral, though the community does not necessarily take it as neutral. They may take it as one side is better than the other. So I think that's great, because if it's a neutral system like that, you're going to be objectively looking at your strengths and weaknesses, because every type is going to have your strengths and weaknesses, and you can't escape from it, no matter what type you are. So, and the second one, can you change your type? I mentioned this before, like, it's my opinion that people don't change their type. And that's not for me, like, the most important questions, like what can you do with the type is the important thing. I think being able to recognize it, like recognize you have a type, is actually very helpful to be able to know that.
Thank you. Thank you. Next up is going to be Julie, Mike, Jyoti, Jairo, and Rupali. Julie, what's your question?
My question is, the book on the Enneagram, the personality book, it has the 9 different types, and then it has them qualified as unhealthy, healthy, and healthy, unhealthy, and healthy, average, and unhealthy. and then it describes each of them, and then it gives a answer for each of the 9 types on how to get out of it, which I just thought was brilliant. I was wondering if it sounds like this kind of helps you get more balanced, because anything overdone is too much or reactive maybe. Can you expel more on the positive things you can get out of it?
Yeah, so just like with the Enneagram, there's people who do propose models for that with the MBTI. There's healthy versions of types, unhealthy versions. You can see that with Dario Nardi's work. Like, what is each type like when they're in their shadow? What's each type like when they're adapting to society? Like, that's the normal type. And what's each type like when they are transcendent? And I think you get a lot of great information on that from his work. And I think MBTI community has a plethora of great information on self-development.
Excellent. Next up is Mike, Jyoti, Jairo, and Rupali. Mike, what's your question?
I view that a lot of these things depend on what hat you put on when you take the test. And if, for example, if you're presenting a paper to a group of a group of colleagues, you're in a different mode than if you're talking to one of your clients, and maybe even a different mode when you're talking to your family, and a different mode if you're talking to say a police officer who stops you for traffic situations. Now, how you answer the questions depends on what hat you put on to go through it. And then and a variant of that is it also depends on how strong you are, for example, in J versus P or E versus I. And that number is probably important. Now, there's one more variable in this. The 4 or 5 items that you use are not necessarily independent of each other. There's some other factors, and in doing a questionnaire design, they call that orthogonality. How do you want to answer that? And then there's an MMPI group that has another set of evaluations.
Let's keep to this much, and let Leon answer that. Leon, go ahead.
So I think the test. Okay, so the way I look at the test is the way I look at impressionistic painting versus realistic painting. So the realistic painting is getting to the reality. The impressionistic test, I love impressionism, but it's kind of looking like the reality, but it's not actually matching. So the way I look at the test is not accurate. The types exist, and what the reason why it's not accurate is that the test is measuring behavior, and the functions, they are ways of processing information, kind of like our hardware, and then behavior is the expression of it. So that's the thing with, for instance, introversion and extroversion. Jung defines it very differently. It's not outgoing versus being more reserved. Everyone varies on a bell curve, but it's binary when it comes to his definition of subjective versus objective processing, which is a whole nother discussion.
Leon, many people are asking for tests. What test would you recommend?
I'm like
to figuring out your type.
Okay, well, I'm kind of like the worst person to ask because I'm anti-test, anti-TI test, but I think if you look at Dario Nardi's test on cognitive functions, I know he still has it up, but you type in cognitive functions test Dario Nardi, at the very least, his test is getting to the functions and not like the idea of behavior, which is actually an incorrect portrayal of Carl Jung's work.
Sure. Wonderful. I recommend these keys to cognition test, which also gives your score on different functions and how what are you more skillful in using. So I like this one as a
We might be talking about the same thing.
point. Yeah, and I think, oh, maybe. And again, I'm very skeptical about tests as well. So you can't really use tests by themselves, but it kind of gets you started thinking about it. Even just those questions are very useful. All right, let's see who's next. I lost track here. Give me just a second. Hold on.
Jyoti.
Yes, Jyoti. Yeah, so it's going to be Jyoti, Jairo, and Rupali, and then we're going to breakout rooms. Jyoti, what's your question?
Yeah, well, Leon, this was a very, very thorough implication of what you are doing, psychotherapy based on all these 4 components. Who are the kind of subjects, the patients who will not be able to benefit from it? Because my feeling is that the patient or a subject has to have some sophisticated intellect in order to participate in this. Right? Am I right? Like there are people like who are completely irrational.
That's a good question. That's a good question.
Okay, go ahead.
So meaning, the thing about therapy, right, is that it's not like the client is a pail and filling them with information, right? It's not so much necessarily an intellectual exercise, even though the theory is intellectual, right? I don't even have to mention about the MBTI. I don't even have to mention about this theory of like diffusing from your ego in order for the client to be able to engage in this material. So I'm asking them, how are you feeling based on what are your needs right now? Like what's something that you could do, right? I don't use terms like I'm gonna like activate you behaviorally, like I'm gonna do some behavioral activation, and if that makes sense. I'm not using these, or I'm not even saying I'm gonna work with your irrational beliefs. We just talked about what the beliefs are.
Can I ask just one more question? How do you know? Can I say that? How do you know they are not faking it? Do you have like a margin for that? And I'll shut up now.
Oh, like the client. For me, it's not necessarily that important because the faking it would become a clue of something, right? And if a client is fake, they're bringing that everywhere. So there's already people telling them, oh, you're fake, right? I want to do something different. So I let them bring that into the session and work with what the story they're working with, because you actually see that if they come up with a fake story, it's like some sort of coping mechanism, right? But if I dismiss the story right away, we're not going to be able to investigate how they're using that story.
Jairo, what's your question? You're next.
Wait a minute.
What's your question?
Okay. So I'm very new to this, and so one interesting thing was when you had the 4 chairs, and you had one talking to the other 3, and the rotating. So
yes.
Can you guide me through that? Like if I were to try it out on myself, and in particular, like for example, the intuitive me talking to the feeling me and thinking me, and what's the other one? Sensing me. How's that work?
There's this great YouTuber called Heidi Priebe, which she actually has her own cognitive functions talk with one another. It's definitely worth checking out. I'll try to find it too. I'll put it in the chat if I
Sure. After we come back.
After, okay.
Next up is Rupali. Rupali, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for this presentation. So my question is about how do you use this personality types in functioning of an organization? You know, when you kind of give this personality test or kind of figure out where people in the organization are, how can you use it to kind of help people within the organization be better or get the organization to work at a higher functioning level?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is a good point. There's clients. There's going to be members of the company who are going to be more thinking based, others more feeling based. You know, the test I say is kind of inaccurate, but the thing is, it doesn't mean that you can't work with it. So the clients are going to, not clients, but like the employees are going to very naturally speak from whatever their point of view is. And you can almost identify if it's thinking based or feeling based. And there's going to be even feeling types that prefer a kind of thinking kind of style, and any sort of combination like that. The same thing, you can also say like different people in the company bring different kind of value based on how they think. And so if you get them to work together, kind of like with the chair technique, one side fully expresses itself, and then the other side repeats back, empathizes with that perspective, and then shares their point of view. Going across like that, it could really help in terms of conflict resolution.
Leon, I interrupted you when you were answering Jairo. Did you want to say anything more about the technique, or do you want to just give a link later on?
The Jairo?
Jairo, he asked the question about how do you actually use the 4-chair.
Oh, okay. I thought you said the Jairo technique.
Oh, no.
No, Jairo had his own technique. Yeah, well, you can actually like imagine like kind of what Carl Jung does with active imagination. You can envision that side sitting across from you. And some people are visual, some people are not. So it really depends on whether you're a visual person. Like imagine that side. You can almost like see how they're presenting. Can you take on the character, right, of that side? How they carry themselves. And when you take it on, you could actually then you go back and forth. You just if you want to try this out on yourself, a great way is through writing. So you could have one sheet of paper, completely feelings, nothing else, right? The other's next paper, thinking, nothing else. And this is, something that's related to couples therapy, because often the couples they're fighting each other a lot, and they're not allowing each other to fully express their own voice. So when you get them to write it all out and give it to the other person, you're really delivering something that they may not even seen before. They haven't seen the complete story of the other person's side of the story. So it's the same thing within yourself. You could actually write it out on a piece of paper and just allow for the process. Don't think too much about like what is the technique here, right? Just think whatever feeling is, put that on a piece of paper and allow that process to happen.
Wonderful.